So what P.A. Yeomans put forward with his Scale of Permanence was the first organized, systematic way of approaching larger landscape design in order of how permanent features are within a landscape. So we're going to follow this through and look at the considerations we had for the design of the farm here. And this is the element of keyline design I will always use in my design work. It doesn't mean I will lay things out on a keyline patterning or use a keyline plough. We happen to use them here because it fit our context and unique circumstance. But I will always, in my design work, follow this scale of permanence. So we start with the climate, understanding the climate we're in. That will dictate what sort of animal and plant species we're utilizing and how we leverage microclimates to extend growing seasons, etc. And then we start by understanding the shape of the land, which you'll see in the other videos, looking at mapping and the software you can use to develop keyline cultivation, patterning, etc. And that dictates how water moves through a landscape. So we'll look at all our different water considerations. And that would lead to, in Yeoman scale, access or roads in a farm, because roads are solid surfaces that can catch and move water for us rather than being an erosive force. It's not so relevant in our scale here, we're not building any roads. And that will lead us to tree planting patterns and all the various forms they take. That's then leading us to our buildings and infrastructure, fencing, and then soils. Soils are the most malleable element in design. They're very easy to destroy, but they're also very easy to build through sensible means. We have many ways of building soil, and all our productions here are aimed at building topsoil. That's the default aspect of regenerative design in my mind. It's got to be soil building, so we're doing that in many ways. Here in red you see the property boundary. We have about 10 hectares at the farms, 25 acres. This is an area of the neighbour's land that we market garden on, and it's not our property, and we just have a friendly agreement to use that land. It's an elderly gentleman that owns a strip of forest adjacent to our farm, and he will never use it for anything, so he's kindly let us utilise that land. Here you see two streams flowing through the landscape that join together at the bottom of the farm and head off to the lake Freakin to the south of us, where we like to go and fish and relax in the summer. And we have established riparian around the stream here, and this is forestry. So we have about 1.7 hectares of old spruce forestry, and it's about 70, 80 years old. There's a gap in the middle here. This is where overground electricity line runs that eventually will be dug down in the ground, which will open up another hectare of land on our farm. It'll make a bit of a mess in the meantime. And then about 1.8 hectares of regenerating forest land that's been cut about 6-7 years ago, and it's coming back with birch and rowan and oak and lime and ash, wonderful timber species of a mixed nature which we like to keep, that we rotate our pigs through. Then we have a little larch plantation here, and then we have top field, nut field, front field. This is we call Bucky Field. It's a sea buckthorn plantation. So nut field's about 2 hectares, about 1.8 hectares in top field, 0.6 of a hectare is making up front field. And then we have our farm centre. So we have the house and a root cellar and our polytunnel. And then we have our workshop and egg packery. And the circles here are where we put the yurts up in the summer to have people gathering and for eating and teaching, etc. We have a magazine for accommodation and a couple of barns here. And we have this public road leading through the site. And that's got pros and cons. It means we have neighbours up here and there's traffic through the farm. But it also means that the government will clear the snow in the winter, which in this climate with the 6-month winter is a very handy cost-saving thing for us. You see the scale, approximately 100 meters is that distance there. And so our main climatic considerations at the farm scale in this circumstance are wind. We have very strong winds that come up the valley here. The reason that the farm is called Ridgedale is the name of the property is officially Åsen, which is ridge in Swedish. And we're in an area called Fryksdalen, the valley of Fryken, the lake. So we're on a ridge in the wider context of a valley, so ridges and dales, ridges and valleys. And so those ridge shapes create a big funnel for wind that can have quite damaging effects when it does come up. Often we've observed storms coming across the lake to the south of us and splitting either side of the ridges and missing us almost entirely. It's quite an interesting little microclimate. Now, we don't have topography detailed here, but the slope of the land is falling this way, so these fields are south facing generally. This is more east facing, is sloping down towards the river slightly, but pretty good solar orientation. And in terms of laying out our farm, we're working with pasture and silver pasture systems. It's going to be the landform and water that really affect the shape of our design, because we're working with Keyline design. And that's because we've tested this decision in our context, where we knew we had compaction in the fields by measuring with a penetrometer around the fields. And we knew that we wanted to even out water distribution across the landscape, because we had wet spots and drier areas in the center of ridges, etc. So that fit our context, and we decided to lay out the farm on a Keyline pattern. But that might not be appropriate. That's a decision that needs testing. So solar orientation become more important for little microclimates like our annual gardens, and we've utilized a couple of unique spots in the farm to put together some little microclimates, for example, for our cold climate vineyard, to eke the growing season a little bit where we can. So looking at the shape of the land, that really dictated the layout of the farm that you'll see in other videos of how we've laid out the Keyline pattern using digital tools. But let's have a look at water then. So our main water pattern is Keyline design, which we will end up putting on here in the tree layer. But we'll look at the other water sources on the farm. We have a couple of springs, and this has actually been drained in the past underground using field drainage that's kind of failed. We have quite strong surface flow at times of year. So this whole area of the nut field is quite wet, that you couldn't use it for pasture. There's a lot of sedge and other species growing. And it's something that we could develop over time. We have streams that are falling in altitude. There's about 60 meters fall from the top of the farm to the bottom of the farm. So we have some water falling under gravity that could be useful. We have a spring over here and a couple of other insignificant little springs. But the main supply of water comes from a well next to the house, and that leads underground to a tap in the garden and to the barns for animals. And because we wanted to mimic nature, moving animals around on our holistic plan grazing setup, we knew we wanted to have access to water everywhere. And probably one of the best investments you could make if you're running livestock is to invest in polypipe to be able to run water and reticulate it around field boundaries. We've done all the way up the fence line of this field and into the forest pastures to be able to water pigs up in the forest. And we've actually crossed that. There's a big pipe under the road that the stream flows through, so we've gone up the other side of the road in Nutfield, as well as along the bottom of the riparian here and up the edge of this field. That's not quite accurate. It actually goes up the fence line to access this part of the field. So therefore we've got water coming from our well that we can tap with quick release valves that we position all over the place, so that we can use 100-meter coils of gas line on the back of an eggmobile or broiler pens, or our cows and sheep have automatic waterers. And with 100 meters of gas line we can reach anywhere in our field paddocks. So that's a great investment that I highly recommend, to be able to move water around without having to carry it. So that's like the main investment for field water. And then we also have invested in the market garden setup. So the market gardens, these are our north beds, and we have 1,500 square meters of beds. So we call these north beds, and we have south beds and east and west beds here. And to be able to get, we use a sprinkler system because we're doing a lot of turnover of crops throughout the season, which means we need to be able to work with watering systems that aren't on the actual bed, because they would require different spacings. For example, drip irrigation, you would need different drip spacings for each crop setup, and it's just too inefficient for us because we're also rotating our crops on a 10-year cycle. So we've chosen to go with sprinklers that are connected. We have 4 overhead sprinklers that are connected by inch pipe, and we've cut that inch pipe to allow us to use it as a modular setup in any of the gardens. And to feed the market gardens, we've put in a 250,000 litre GCL lined pond that's fed from the mountain stream, also a spring up here. You can see videos on how we've constructed that. There's a spring that feeds into that, and we've also put in a pipe about 80 meters long that feeds into the pond, because the stream is falling about 80 centimeters across that length, and then that exits back to the stream. And the stream has enough flow pretty much all year round that it turns the water over every 48 hours, so it's quite well oxygenated, and that means we can utilize this for growing trout and crayfish as well. And that goes to a pump, and through a lot of careful calculation we've worked out exactly the power of the pump we need to be able to pump uphill through all the various fittings that we need. So we pump that along the fence line of Buckyfield, and it has a junction here where it pops up, and then it also goes under the yard to the market gardens here. So it has 2 exit points, and that means we can attach our watering system in any of the gardens to irrigate our crops. And that puts down about 4 cubic meters of water an hour. So it's ample water supply to meet our market garden needs, and we can put a lot of water down very quickly. We're aiming for about 4 centimeters of water a week for most crops, so it's quite important to calculate the needs of that system. Some other elements that we're thinking about doing in the future is a pond that catches some, there's not really a spring, but some water surfacing in the winter months, and it gets quite wet in this area. It's a natural depression. If you look at the contour map, you'll see that. So this is an area we've started excavating but haven't lined yet, and that will be a pond that goes back to the stream there. And it might be in the future we play around with, we need to put a better wetland crossing over here so we can have a vehicle accessing this other part of our field, and it could be for broiler pens or for the eggmobile. And so it might be we start to just create shallow natural ponds that spill over and just start utilizing this part of land as a habitat, and start planting species that don't mind wet feet here, and just turn that into a bit more of a thriving habitat. It's not a big priority for us, but because the drainage is not working, it might be something that we decide to utilize. This spring creates a bit of a marshy area next to the spruce plantation. That's a wonderful habitat, so we won't touch that at all. There's different species and flowers and insects that utilize that land, so we'll leave that be. Another part of water collection that we've done in the farm centre, we have our vegetable washing station here, and that pipes underground to a pond and then filters through our paddy ponds in the middle of our gardens. It's always nice to have water in the middle of annual vegetable gardens because of frogs, etc., that can eat a lot of insects throughout the year. And then that goes underground to the ditch that leads back along the edge of our property back to the stream flow. So that's one element, and the septic from the farm also exits along that ditch. So that's most of our water considerations. We've invested a bit of money in piping and quick release valves around the farm, and we've invested in a secure supply of water for the market gardens, because we don't have enough water in our well. We have quite a shallow well, about 40 meters deep, next to the house, and that's enough to water all the animals and for the domestic needs and the slaughtery, etc. But it's not enough to put down the amount of water we need in the summer for the market gardens. So the main pattern in our fields, you'll see videos on how to create the patterning, but our overall patterning is Keyline design. And so what we've done there is marked out the field boundaries, and we've created an offset, which you'll see how to do in the videos on the computer programs there. And the headland, is the area that you need to mark out, because a tractor needs space to turn round at the end of a row, whether it's a line of trees or whether you're pulling a keyline plough and then you turn round, start again. So these offsets are the areas within which we're finding a pattern. And in top field, it's quite away from the edge of the field because it's such a steep slope here that we're not driving a tractor on that land. So we find these main areas, and then we generate a pattern within those areas based on the topography of the landscape, which you'll see in separate videos. And it looks approximately like this. In this field, there's two patterns that look somewhat different and converge over here somewhere. And in front field, there's just a sweeping curve that you see the silver pasture trees on. So that's the water layer of our design. We've evened out water through the landscape using subsoiling to deal with our compaction and help speed up subsoil regeneration by letting gas and water move through the subsoil, allowing plants to root deeper. We've combined that with holistic plant grazing to really ramp up the nutrient and water cycling. And then we've dealt with water issues around the farm of getting water to livestock and getting water to irrigate the market gardens. So pretty simple stuff, pretty straightforward. But water being the limiting factor of all production, it's the basic starting point once we understand the shape of the land and our climatic needs. Access is not such a big issue for us because we're not building any roads here. The access for us really relates to fencing, as in where we get into the fields. So we'll leave that one out for now. Let's look at the tree systems we've been putting in at the farm. Here in Buckyfield, we've put in rows of sea buckthorn with Japanese quince underneath, which is like a lemon substitute in this climate. And we've done that on pretty much straight rows because the field is pretty flat but sloping down towards the river. And along the edge we've planted hops, which we'll be putting up on poles soon. And that's for our local brewer. And we've put hops all along this riparian in front field too. And that's a great edge crop. It's a forest edge crop, and it's utilizing a bit of land that we wouldn't use anyway. Once it's established and the poles are up, it's a very low maintenance crop that could produce quite a good yield and income on the side. And in exchange, the brewer has determined his needs and will buy everything we can produce. And he brings the spent grain to supplement the feed of the pigs also. Now we have quite a significant windbreak on the south side of the farm. 6 rows of willow with alder and spruce wide planted behind it to create a ramp shape. We're trying to create a 45 to 60 degree ramp to send, this will be the alder on the back row planted every metre, spruce every 3 meters, which allows it to grow quite bushy, and then multiple rows of willow that will alternately harvest so that there's always a few standing tall, creating that habitat and windbreak. And we can send wind up to 10 times the height of the back of the windbreak. These alder will be 10 meters tall in a few years' time, and that will ramp our prevailing winds up over the field. And then over time we're just breaking up the landscape with tree systems so that the wind is constantly being buffered. So along both sides of the road here we've planted oaks, chestnuts, hazel, every 4 meters to make what's called an avenue planting. It's land that's not being utilized for anything else. And these will be pruned timber trees. We'll prune the lateral branches while they're still young so that they heal up well. And that will create what I call the inheritance planting. It will give my children some nice straight hardwood logs to build a new house or whatever needs doing in the future. And we've also put a hedgerow in at the side of this field. And our process, wherever we've put fencing actually, is to plant hedgerows. We use 2 rows 50 centimeters apart, 30 centimeters between the trees. And we will lay that, we'll cut through the stems, lay them, and start creating a living fence that can go on for generations. Because whenever you put up perimeter fencing, it's deteriorating the day you buy it and install it. So it's good to plan for the future, and it takes many years to establish a living fence. So that will actually go all the way around our fence line eventually. We have some protection from timber trees, but they will get cut at some point in the next decade. And we've put a windbreak at the top because we do have some winds funneling down the valley sometimes here. So even if you have protection around currently, it's important to consider the future land use of your neighbour's property too. Because as soon as other properties cut their forestry, it will open up very different pathways for wind. So it's a long-term planning. And so we'll be putting in hedgerow on this edge of the field too, and down at this edge here. And then we are working with silver pasture lanes in top field at every 18 meters. These are assemblies of apple, pear, plum, cherry, and black currants, gooseberries, raspberries, etc. And they're planted, because they're a little bit more east to west, we've planted nut trees on the fruit trees on the back of the rows with hazel in between. So they're 8-meter spacings with a few hazel in between them. And then on the front of the row, we've placed berry fruit. So you have an arrangement like so, where the sun can give full light to all of the different plants there. It's a similar setup in front field. However, because front field is more north to south, we've planted fruit trees in the center with berry fruits on either side, because the sun arcs over and gives everything light. Here we have 18 meters between the rows, and we've decided upon the spacings because of the maximum amount. We're trying to grow the maximum amount of biomass we can in our short growing season, but because it's a bit more east to west, we increased the spacing to minimize the shading behind, but also give us quite robust windbreaking. And research in this climate shows that between 8 and 24 meters is the optimal beneficial interactions between the tree systems and the pasture. So we wanted to pack it in quite tight. We're really trying to intensify productions here, as well as bring about beneficial interactions between different systems and create extra habitats, yields, etc. So in front field, we've put them very much closer together, every 12 meters between rows here, with a slightly different configuration that you see in the tree section. And then in nut field, we're working to propagate many types of nuts from around the world to try and find hardy nut varieties that will grow and give us a crop here. It's a long-term experiment. It doesn't make up an economic element to the farm, because it's just a fun thing that we are interested in. A lot of people are limited by their climatic conditioning, cultural conditioning. It's too cold here, that won't grow here. Oh, it's too dry here, this won't work, etc. And people have told us, no, can't grow any nuts here, the season's too short. And yet I've been to botanical gardens here and seen old walnut trees 200 years old with young saplings growing underneath them. So I think we need to do a lot more breeding work, and it's not universities or agricultural companies that will do that. It's strange people like ourselves. So we've been planting on a grid pattern, and we put in walnuts and chestnuts and pecans, and we've been sourcing nuts from around the world, and we've got some of the hardiest varieties of chestnuts known to humans, and we've planted them double spacings. So if you imagine this triangle here, eventually half of those will come out, and that will leave the optimal long-term spacing, because we're aiming for a 30% canopy cover. Because in our climate, with the levels of light that we have, up to 30% canopy cover doesn't reduce the loss of pasture yield at all. And that's our main consideration here. And then on our amphitheatre, sort of natural amphitheatre shape here, we've planted alder on contour to use as a living trellis for our vineyard. We have 5 varieties of cold hardy grapes, and because the sun is giving us light reflected off that pond onto these banks all throughout the day, we thought it's a lovely little microclimate to try something a little more unusual. And it's a steep slope, not suitable for grazing anyway or machine work, and we've protected that with another hedgerow that will leave to grow to about 6 meters tall, that traps that heat and reduces wind in there too, to really shift the microclimate up there. And we have our riparians here, which are already very well established. So we have all these areas of buffering against the strong winds that we get here. We're looking to put in some more berry fruits. We've put in some trellised plants around the garden, and we also have established trees, and then the buildings here do the same job like the vineyard. This creates a sort of natural amphitheatre that's a bit sheltered from the wind, facing the sun, to trap as much heat in as we can. We've put in some other tree plantings around the farm. Excuse me. And up here in the regenerating forest, this is an area that we run the pigs through, and we're allowing that to, we haven't fenced it with any permanent fencing yet, we're using temporary electric fencing, and what we're doing is running the pigs through in small paddocks throughout the summer, and what happens as the pigs dig through, they allow the seed bank to bring forth a flush of annual and perennial herbaceous species that are great. What we're seeing is it's pasture species coming back underneath. So we're creating forage that allows us some extra grazing space. At the same time, we are allowing that forest to regrow in its natural sequence and its natural structure. Forests naturally have a lumpy structure, multiple edges on 3D levels. And we're really interested in leaving our children with a mixed, diverse forest patch, which, Sweden is mostly monocultural spruce all over the place, and that's got big issues with biodiversity and also with the hydrology when they do their mass clear cutting. So we're looking at how do we deal with forestry with very low inputs and create more climate stable and still economically viable models of forestry. And to have oak and ash and all these lovely hardwoods, you don't see them in the landscape around here because nobody's left their forest to regenerate. It's all cut and then replanted again. Up in the spruce forest, we put our tree house up here, which we're using as a transition tool to enable us to extract some value out of the landscape there without cutting the forest down. There's enough timber up here for all of our timber needs for the rest of our lives and beyond. And it's only worth a small amount if someone came in and clear cut the whole lot. So rather than cut it down, we're going to rent out the tree house to allow us to get an income annually. It's much better financially than cutting the forest on a small scale every 70, 80 years. And as we start to thin out the mature trees here, it will open up light in the forest floor, which will allow this flurry of regeneration of hazels and birch and oak, etc. So that's our plan for the forestry up there. And in terms of buildings, we haven't really done much with our buildings, the next layer in the scale of permanence. All of our animal infrastructure is mobile. We've added a slaughtery and other infrastructure that we need. The slaughtery is here in the yard. And we've added a greenhouse on the south side of the house. But we're not doing any major things with the house or buildings yet because they're already in usable condition and we don't want to prioritize any big investments there. And then our fencing, we work with different types of fencing, but we have perimeter fencing mainly for elk and deer eating our trees, which runs around the road here and on the outside of this hedgerow. So that's a 10,000 volt fence for elk and deer, but also for wolves and lynx. And it also runs around the top of this field, and it runs up here too, and it runs on this side of the road. And so they're the main perimeter fencing we've invested in to protect those tree systems that we've established. Now we also have temporary sort of low fencing around the gardens to stop ducks and other creatures around the farm coming in, and they're just made of deer netting and windbreak, which we also have around the farm here, and little entry points throughout that. So that's mainly all we're doing with fencing, although we're now going to start fencing up in our main tree paddocks. There's a fence here already, which is where we keep the pigs in the winter, and we'll divide this land up into paddocks that we can rotate the pigs through for different time periods. And we haven't worked out exactly how we're going to do that yet, but it will be quite low-tech fencing with posts and probably electric wires. It might be high tensile, but the land is so undulating that it would be quite problematic and possibly a lot more expensive with high tensile. And then all the animals are moved with solar electric, either nets or reel systems, and they move in the paddocks according to our grazing plan, and so they protect the trees, etc., on their path through the fields. We're always grazing the fields from top to bottom, so we come in at the top of the field and graze down and then head out. We'll come into the top of a field and graze down and out, and the same, we'll come in at the top of this field and down and out. Because we're working with the eggmobiles using an ATV, and the eggmobile is quite heavy, so it's much better for us to get them up high in the landscape and use gravity to work us back down each day, rather than trying to pull this heavy thing uphill every day, because when the ground is very wet, that just causes a problem. So we have access points at the top and bottom in that big fence to allow us to come in and out of the fields. And then soil. Well, soil is really, we're building soil in multiple ways through our Keyline subsoiling, which is smashing up the subsoil, allowing plants to root deeper, and then combining that with holistic plant grazing to ensure we never overgraze a single grass plant. It's quite amazing to go through that process and know that you're managing millions of organisms to, you're benefiting those organisms by allowing them to express their physiology and not get overgrazed. And then all of the tree planting systems are only helping to further improve nutrient cycling, buffering of the landscape, creating habitat for other creatures, biomass that's put onto the ground continually. So we've got soil building going on all over the place. And then in our annual gardens, we're working with a no-dig system. So we're never turning that soil over, we're just adding organic matter year after year. And that will eventually just build up such a deep, rich topsoil with the soil microbiology taking that nutrient and bringing it down into the ground, that we don't need to use broad forks or other tools that we currently use in the market garden. It just won't be necessary. And some of the best gardens I've ever been to are really old no-dig gardens. So for me, there's no better way to build topsoil than a no-dig approach in a market garden setting. And then the other element of that is keeping our riparians intact. When we put paddocks up in this field, for example, we will fence out the stream to ensure that animals don't get into the riparian area. So every step along the way, we are trying to optimize energy movement and transfer throughout the ecosystem, throughout the farmscape, basing the prioritization on how permanent those features are in our landscape. But everything rests with soil. Everything is building topsoil or preserving topsoil, keeping perennial roots on steep slopes. There's a couple more tree systems I forgot to put in here. This is medicine cabinet, and this is contour plantings of high nutraceutical foods for our tonics before the long winter to make sure we're full of vitamins, etc. And we'll probably put in some berry fruit hedges around the edges of these these market gardens. We've got some already in the south here, along the edge here, to protect from the wind. So we have a nice efficient way to go through each layer, building up this complex farm design in simple steps. And I've been using this in my design work for many years now, and I will always follow this scale of permanence. It's a sublime approach to taking design and breaking it up into manageable steps. It's often, it's the same with planning a business. It seems very overwhelming in the beginning, but when we break it down into these logical orders and steps, it's just a step-by-step process, and you can upload the layers of your design. If you did this on a computer, it doesn't matter if you do it on paper or a computer. Sometimes it's quicker to lead to a bill of quantities. For example, every time on Google Earth or any of the digital programs I put in a tree lane, then I automatically know how long it is. So it's very easy to create a bill of quantities. If I know I'm planting trees every 4 meters, and I know I have 1800 meters of tree lanes, I can calculate how many trees instantly. So it's many advantages, working out how much fence you need, etc.